In the heart of the Egyptian desert lies a sentinel carved from stone, a timeless riddle, standing watch over the pyramids of Giza. The Great Sphinx. Who carved this ancient guardian? And when? For centuries, it has been an unsolved mystery, one that defies the explanations of historians, archaeologists, and scientists. But in the early 1990s, a bold theory emerged, a theory that could rewrite the history of this monument and challenge everything we know about the ancient world. Was the Sphinx created not by the pharaohs of Egypt, but by a civilization lost to time? Join us as we explore the groundbreaking research that suggests the Sphinx is far older than anyone ever imagined, and dive deep into the secrets hidden beneath its weathered stone. In 1990, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch visited Egypt to study the Sphinx, the largest ancient statue in the world. The objective was to study it from a geological perspective. At first, he believed that the classical theory correct in its assumption that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC by King Khafre. Nevertheless, many question marks around the Sphinx remained unanswered. Why no inscriptions have been found on its body indicating his age or who carved it? Why is its body eroded? And why is the head size inconsistent with the body size despite the capability of the ancient Egyptian sculptors? By the end of his investigation, Robert Schoch concluded that the Sphinx is much older than what is known. He concluded that the statue's age dates to 10,000 years BC. 3. Who carved the Sphinx? The understanding of this episode depends on the previous one too. The age of the pyramids. The Sphinx, a statue with a lion's body and a human head, it is the largest ancient statue in the world carved from a single rock, 73 m long and 20 m high, meaning about a 6-story building. The Sphinx was carved from the bedrock itself, as huge blocks of stones were removed from around it, and they are currently the ones that form the temples in front of it. Despite the much research work done, the Sphinx is still a mysterious statue because we did not find any clear evidence to tell us who carved it, when, and why. Let us go back to the beginning and see how our story began. In the 80s, there was a person named John Anthony West, an independent researcher in the history of civilizations, who was reading a book called Sacred Science by the French author Chouard de Lubec's. He paused at a sentence that caught his attention. The author of the book believed that the erosion on the body of the Sphinx was caused by water, not wind, as the Egyptologists believed. Well, where did this water come from if the climate of Egypt is dry? The only explanation is that the Sphinx statue was present while it was raining heavily on Egypt at least 7,000 years BC. These erosion marks are apparent to everyone, but they needed solid scientific proof. He was unable to do this as he was not a geologist, and cannot prove it scientifically. He kept searching for a scientist to support his hypothesis until he got to know one, Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology at Boston University and a specialist in rock analysis and erosions. John Anthony West visited him, and before he explained the matter, he did a little trick by showing him a photo of a rock and asked, "Is the erosion of this rock caused by water or wind?" Robert Schoch confidently answered, "This is erosion caused by water." When he revealed the photo of the rock and found that it was nothing but the Sphinx, he was puzzled because he knew that the subject had a mystery. However, he was convinced to help Anthony West in his research. Both had traveled to Egypt to study the Sphinx. When they began inspecting the statue's body, they found clear marks of erosion on the body in broad lines on its back, sides, and chest. Anyone standing in front of the statue will see the signs of erosion. As a geologist, these signs have only one explanation: what the French Chouard said was true, and these are signs of erosion caused by water. Thus, the Sphinx was sculpted before or during the Mousterian pluvial in Egypt, older than 7,000 years BC. It was exposed to long periods of rainfall, and its body was left in water and mud for centuries, which caused the erosion of its limestone body until it became in this form. The back of the Sphinx is eroded to the point that it becomes almost straight, unlike the backs of the statues of lions with curves. This was the first step in proving that the Sphinx witnessed the Mousterian pluvial. The second step is that Robert Schoch studied the Sphinx enclosure walls to discover other evidence that supports his theory. It is well known that the Sphinx was carved into a rock of the pyramid's plateau itself. This made it appear as if the statue was in the middle of a trench or basin. Note that the archaeologists believed that erosion marks on the walls were caused by the winds, while the difference between the two for geologists is enormous. The limestone layers are on top of each other, hard layers above softer layers. When the wind blows for thousands of years, it removes the soft layers and leaves the harder layers intact. Thus, the horizontal profile appears in the stones, and this is found in structures and tombs on the Giza Plateau. However, the rainy weather has an entirely different form. Round vertical grooves begin to occur in the rocks, and after hundreds or thousands of years, it becomes in this form. Well, if we look at the Sphinx enclosure wall, we will find it all eroded by rain. This was the second geological evidence of the validity of the theory that the Sphinx was present before the climate change. Schoch did not stop and tried to find more evidence. They did seismic studies around the Sphinx. This study aimed to know the form of the bedrock under the Sphinx as for the idea of the sonar of the ship, whose goal is to know the depth of the sea bottom so the ship safely sail. They placed 4 sensors around the body of the Sphinx, then someone would hit on an iron plate to generate sound waves. These sound waves penetrate the ground and return to the surface again, and they measure their speed by measuring the speed of the sound waves returned. The shape of the rocks under the Sphinx is known. If the rocks were hard under the Sphinx, the sound would travel faster than if the rocks were decomposed. He analyzed the output data. As a result, it was discovered that the depth of the decomposed layer under the Sphinx is not trivial, and it is 3 meters at some points. An upper decomposed rocky layer and a lower solid layer, this depth would not have happened if the rain had fallen for 10 or 20 years. No, it must rain heavily for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. This was a new and essential point of his proof that not only the body and the enclosure walls are eroded, but also the bedrock under the Sphinx eroded from the prolonged presence of rain. And this cannot happen in a desert atmosphere. A rainy atmosphere is required. There are 2 temples in front of the Sphinx. The first is called the Sphinx Temple, and the second is called the Valley Temple. The 2 were used in their construction. Stones extracted during the carving of the Sphinx. The builders took stones from the Sphinx enclosure with which the 2 temples were built. As we can see, these stones are water eroded to the same extent as the Sphinx, and along the way between the 3 pyramids, you will find the erosion evidence on the large blocks exposed to the sky. This is just a sample of thousands of similar stones. We talked about 4 pieces of evidence presented by Dr. Robert Schoch. Erosion on the body of the Sphinx, profile of the Sphinx enclosure walls, seismic studies under the Sphinx, and erosion of the temple stones. And there is other evidence, but we have focused on the 4 major points. From a geological point of view, this evidence concluded that the Sphinx witnessed heavy rain. Moreover, if its true age could be between 7 to 11,000 years BC, indeed, there is no specific number. This means that it does not belong to the dynastic period, but could be much older, and the dynasties that starts around 3000 BC had discovered and reused it. The hypothesis presented by Robert Schoch was scientific and based on geological studies. If someone wants to argue and criticize it, it doesn't help to say, you want to distort the Egyptian civilization. This won't work. As long as we speak in terms of geology, we must argue about it in the same manner, otherwise, it is a waste of time. The Egyptian scientist, Dr. Farouk Elbaz, a professor at the Remote Sensing Department at Boston University, and a colleague of Dr. Robert Schoch. Dr. Farouk Elbaz insists that the Sphinx was carved out around 2500 BC. As we all have learned in school. However, water erosion remains a problem for which there is no explanation other than rain. Dr. Farouk argued that this erosion is a result of the water, but it could be the underground water of the Nile flood. If there is a rise in the groundwater level due to the flood, the Sphinx enclosure has been filled for years, and that is the cause of this erosion. Nevertheless, it was a good idea, but it did not hold for long. Robert Schoch quickly sorted out that if we looked at the enclosure wall, we would see this erosion gradient from top to bottom, because the rain descended from top to bottom, not the opposite. If it was underground water, the erosion would not look that way. The second point is that the stones of the temples in front of the Sphinx are high. Some reach a height of 4 to 5 meters. The floodwaters cannot reach that level. How did they erode? It is hard to find an explanation other than it comes from rain, and this point was sorted out. Well, if the statue's age is older than 7,000 years BC, then who carved the Sphinx? What is mentioned in the books is that the Sphinx was carved by King Khafre, the owner of the second pyramid. So why Khafre in particular? There are two reasons why archaeologists adopted this idea. First, the statue of Khafre was found in 1860 in the Valley Temple in front of the Sphinx. The American archaeologist, George Reisner, came in the 30s. As long as we found the statue of Khafre in the Valley Temple, then he is the one who built the temple, and, inevitably, he is also the one who carved the Sphinx. Furthermore, this opinion was taken and turned to be a fact. Second, archaeologists said that the face of the Sphinx resembles the face of Khafre. Based on these 2 points, all Egyptologists considered the Sphinx is Khafre, and if you open most of the books talked about Sphinx, you will find that Sphinx equals Khafre. Well, let us see the validity of these 2 claims. It is not necessary that if the statue of Khafre was found in a temple in front of the Sphinx, that he is the one who carved the Sphinx. In Karnak Temple, for example, we may find 2 chapels close to each other. One is made by a king, and the other is made by a different king. So, finding the statue of Khafre in the Valley Temple in front of the Sphinx is not enough evidence to claim that the Sphinx is carved by him. The second point is the similarity in face properties of Khafre and the Sphinx. John Anthony West was not convinced that the Sphinx resembles Khafre, but he wanted to deny this resemblance scientifically. He consulted a forensic expert, a detective named Frank Domingo, from New York PD, who has long experience in facial identifications. Frank Domingo traveled to Egypt, obtained the necessary permits to study the facial features of the Great Sphinx and the statue of Khafre in the Egyptian Museum. After an intensive study of the features of the 2 statues, he came up with results to clarify the differences between the Sphinx and Khafre. The eyes are wider in the Sphinx than in Khafre, and the width of the mouth is larger than Khafre's, who has a finer one. When he studied the side view of the faces, more significant differences also appeared. That the angle between the chin and the eye is more than double that of the Sphinx because of the protrusion of his jaw. The ancients were masters in sculpture, so they would make statues precisely like each other. Like the statues of Akhenaten, his statues are all like each other, or the sarcophagus and mask of Tutankhamun. Even if there are differences, there are supposed to remain slight differences, but it is clear that the differences between the Sphinx and Khafre are significant, and anyone who compares their faces to pictures today will find them different. We summarize the result in a sentence for the Egyptian archaeologist, Dr. 1122. Salim Hassan, after years of research and excavations at the Sphinx. Till now, we have not concluded that we can be confident enough to confirm the validity of the age of the owner of the Sphinx, and we haven't found a single inscription from its time that clarifies this matter. The New Kingdom themselves were complete ignoramus of everything related to the monument, and we doubt that they knew the facts we have now about the history of the Sphinx. Dr. Salim Hassan, from the book The Sphinx, in the Egyptian Museum, in the same hall as Khafre, a stone stela called the inventory stela. This stela is causing a problem because it says that Khufu made several procedures in the Giza area, including pay attention to the following sentence, going over the plan to repair and decorate the Sphinx. Khufu, who was an ancestor of Khafre, repairs the Sphinx, meaning that the Sphinx was present when Khufu came to power. Consider now the Sphinx's real age, which had to be repaired and restored. The German archaeologist Dr. Brugsch said that based on the stela, King Khufu have seen the Sphinx, and therefore the Sphinx exists before him. Currently, this stela is being criticized because it was written during the 26th dynasty, that is, 2,000 years after the death of Khufu. So what? It was written by ancient Egyptians, and indeed written based on a source of information. However, ignoring this text was due to the insistence on linking the Sphinx and Khafre. Why is the head of the Sphinx not proportional to its body? When viewed from the side, the Sphinx has a small head compared to its body. The other Sphinx statues found in the Egyptian Museum are consistent and beautiful. Well, do you mean that this Sphinx is not consistent? Here, Schock and West propose a revolutionary idea that the head of the Sphinx is not his original and that the original head eroded over time, so the kings of the dynastic period resculpted it again, and perhaps several times. That's why the head is a small size compared to the body. The Great Sphinx of Giza has stood for millennia, guarding its secrets beneath layers of stone and sand. While modern science offers us new insights, the true origins of this ancient monument remain shrouded in mystery.